Good morning or good afternoon, according to where are you connecting from. Welcome to our current lecture series for 2021 at IAAC, and welcome to the lecture of today. A special guest connected from the US in between New York City and Boston. We have here with us Sarah Williams. We have been trying to have Sarah with us in Barcelona for some time. Now we have her online, but hopefully we will also manage to have her physically soon for a visit in Barcelona. For the ones that you don't know, Sarah Williams is the director of Civic Data Design Lab at the MIT, where she also stands as an associate professor. Sarah has been working in many years on the field of big data and data science for public good, for urban decisions, urban policies, urban design, but for the public benefit. She is the co-founder, but also a developer of Envelope.city, which is a web-based software product that allows users to visualize, but also to modify zoning in New York City. So she's very much into working with data so that participatory processes can also happen and participatory design can be achieved. Sarah has won numerous awards, including her being named top 25, one of the top 25 planners in technology and a game changer by Metropolis magazine. Her work has been exhibited all over the world, but she just opened an exhibition a few days ago. It's called Visualizing New York City 2021. And the exhibition takes place at the Center for Architecture in New York. There is actually a link because most of the content or all of the content has been due to the pandemic transformed into virtual. So everybody can actually go through this exhibition. Sarah will be sharing this link with us in a while. She will be talking today on topics that they are very much relevant to what we are working at IAAC, especially with our work, master programs and research related with big data and urban planning and design. She will be discussing about how we can use data as a tool for empowerment, as a tool for empowering people, and as a tool towards benefiting society, how creativity, how design can help us work with these millions of values and numbers that sometimes make no sense unless we use them in a very creative and effective way. And we will also be discussing through some of the work that she will be showing in contrast to certain current practices of using data unethically for surveillance or for increasing profit. Sarah will share with us different ways, but also projects that she has been working on the last years of what she called data action. Data action is a methodology that focuses on using data ethically for the public good and creating communication strategies that expose complex processes such as urban policy issues to broad audiences. Data action is also the title of her new book that we will also be sharing with all of you the link if you are interested to purchase it. And go a bit deeper into some of the work that Sarah will be sharing with us tonight. So no more to add from my side, apart from a huge welcome. Thank you, Sarah, for being with us today. We're really looking forward to your work and also to the discussion that will follow what you will share with us today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I just want to say, start first, how excited I'm here to be with you virtually, and just how honored I am to be able to give a lecture to you all. It's also nice to see all your smiling faces on the other side of the screen. It's so nice to have an open lecture and see faces. So many I've been doing recently, you can't see anything. So it's nice to see all of your faces. And I look forward to chatting with you. Let me share my screen. Let's see here. Let's see. Let's see. Hopefully you guys can see my screen okay.
Yes, we can.
Perfect. We're ready to start then. So as Arti mentioned, and I'm sorry, I realized I didn't know if I pronounced your name right. Hopefully. Okay. I run something called the Civic Data Design Lab at MIT. And I also know that you guys are working on a new program there to think about data in the cities. And I run a new program at MIT called Urban Science, which is an undergraduate program between computer science and urban planning. So also love to discuss that at the end if you have any questions about our program and how it might relate to the work that you're doing. So my research lab really focuses on my background in a way, the tools that the lab uses. I'm trained as a geographer, an architect, an urban planner, and a data scientist. And I actually mashed that training up to do the work that we do in the lab. And maybe it was a path that as along the way, I wasn't sure where it's going, but now, I mean, I just feel so lucky that I have brought all of these skills together. And in doing that, the work of the lab also brings together those kinds of partners. And I think really to use data to create action in the urban environment takes a kind of diverse team, just as it takes a diverse team to build a building. I think it also takes that diversity to create data analytics and policy change. So this is one of the teams that we worked on some of the things that we're doing in Nairobi. We work with the computer science department in Nairobi, urban planners, transportation experts, policy experts. In this team, we have people from the World Bank, but we also have architects and media artists and transportations. And I think really building teams is at the heart of how you can really impact change, because that diversity of interest, advice takes projects much further. So one of the things I like to say is that in the era of big data, it will not change the world unless it's collected and synthesized into tools that have a public benefit. And I'm going to show a short project and perhaps an older project that explains what I mean by this. And this project I did with Laura Kurgan at at Columbia University many years ago. And I think it really embodies what I mean by using data for action. So here we took a data set of the location of people before they went into prison. And so this is their home address. It's a public record. And I mapped it out block by block. And here we're looking at it in Brooklyn, New York. And those very red blocks show you those locations that people lived before they were incarcerated. And it shows that over $1 million is spent to incarcerate people from those blocks. If you zoom in to this area in Brooklyn, you see just these 17 blocks, over $17 million is spent to incarcerate people. And in a way, prisons are becoming the prominent governing institution of the neighborhood. And the idea of this project was to expose this hidden policy that, rather than spending money to alleviate the systematic reasons that people are going prison, such as lack of education, lack of job training programs, lack of public health, lack of assistance for those in poverty. Instead, we send them to prison, and to expose those kinds of systems using the metaphor of $1 million block. The project, we didn't just do this in Brooklyn, we did this in 10 different cities, and the project was displayed in the Architecture League in New York, where we also held a workshop bringing together, just as I said, teams. Here we have people from the community, urban planners, architects, and we're asking them, if you just spend 1 million of that dollars, how might you change these communities? So if you could just think about reinvesting in the community rather than in incarceration, what could be done? And here you can see they have also data cards that tells them other things about that community as they're designing interactive ideas. The map actually wound up on the Museum of Modern Art walls, and they are actually part of the permanent collection. And I mention this because part of what we do in the lab is really thinking about how to bring these policy issues to broad public. So not just people who read academic articles or people who are working in city planning or in the policy aspects of criminal justice, but to everyone. And we really believe communicating through data is a great way to do that. And these maps were seen on the Museum of Modern Art by a congressman who asked if he could use them in his work to advocate for the Criminal Justice Reinvestment Act of 2010, which allocated over $25 million to reentry programs. And so this is programs to train people to work after they're released from prison. And I just mentioned this too, is that you can see how just one image has a long life. From our early work of mapping into 2005 to this life being used to advocate for criminal justice. And currently the maps, I've seen them in so many conferences thinking about the ideas of defunding the police, which are going on in the United States right now. So taking allocation for prisons and reallocating them to social service, to anti-racism behaviors, and so forth. So ultimately, I believe this is how you take data to action. You build these expert teams to ask the right questions, collect the data, quantify it ingenuously, ground truth, the results with the community, like as you saw, working together at the table to think of that, why the issues exist, opening it up. And when I say open up, I mean opening data up to anyone, but opening up data through visualizations, I think is a really important aspect to the work, because not all people can use data, and it's us as communicators and designers that can bring the insights to data to broad groups of people. So this is really the work that's in my recent book, Data for Action. And so what I thought I would do today is talk a bit about the processes that data action outlines. The book at its heart started at the fact that in the last decade, we have created unprecedented amounts of data. And in the next decade, the amount of data in the world is set to grow tenfold. Here we're looking at an example of a Google autonomous vehicle making even a 3D model of an additional second world as it drives through the landscape. And while not all of the data is closed, like the previous example, and we have much open data available and being released by governments, and I know Barcelona has an open data portal, all the excitement from civic hackers to consulting groups such as McKinsey or even Sidewalk Labs, who have set up a whole arm in which is using data to understand cities. there was a pain in my side that many of these groups did not know the ways in which data intentionally or unintentionally can cause harm. And while criticism began to mount from academics about the potential misuse of data, I found we needed to explain to data enthusiasts, my MIT students, and the ways in which we can use data ethically and responsibly to improve the world. So I decided to develop data action, which I believe presents a corrective to standard data practices by acknowledging that data represents the ideologies of those who control its use. Data action at its heart was developed for these data enthusiasts and novices, civic hackers, urban planners, architects, policy experts to provide guidance for using data ethically and responsibly. And I'm going to go through this project, through data action chapter by chapter. And one of the ways that I structured it is each chapter uses an example from my own work to illustrate a practice I think that's important when we're working with data. So the book starts with the premise that big data for cities is not new. And I position the reader within the larger narrative by providing a historical account of the ways those in power have used data to shape our cities, how they have reinforced structural racism, and how data has helped enforce the marginalization of various populations. At the same time, I illustrate the many benefits that analyzing data has provided society, such as establishing social services and stopping the spread of disease. The juxtaposition of these two outcomes provides a reminder that the person analyzing data defines its use. So I'm just going to here pull out one example from this historical perspective. And it starts with a discussion of zoning. This is the first zoning map that was created for New York City in 1917. And it allocates residential district, business district, and you can see a number of undetermined districts, which a lot of them were industrial. At the same time that this map, zoning map, was being developed, it should be noted that in the United States, we made segregated zoning illegal. So essentially, the Supreme Court in 1915 said we could not make any laws about where people of different races could live. And so one of the things that happened out of that new law was that many cities sought to create zoning that maybe it wasn't explicitly based on race, but zoned neighborhoods that were largely African American to only have industry or only have allow prostitution, which devalued the home. So zoning really became a kind of tool of exclusion, and they largely based this on data. And one of the characters in this new effort of what is considered technocratic zoning was Harlan Bartholomew. And Harlan Bartholomew was the St. Louis head of city planning. And he was, in fact, hired by the business commission in St. Louis to address the fact that they could no longer have segregated zoning. And what he did, or when he came, is to map out block by block all of the neighborhoods within St. Louis and estimate those uses looking at race, class, and also land uses. And, the more desirable residential neighborhoods were preserved, and to prevent the movement of finer residential districts by the colored people. And one of the things that's interesting about Bartholomew as a character was that he was very explicit about his racism, very clear, but also used data as his evidence to really build up his new zoning plan. So he went systematically house to house and everywhere in St. Louis to identify places to basically exclude and include into new zoning practices. I think what's also important about Harlan Bartholomew as a character in data analytics in city is that his method of systematically collecting data and then using that as a way to exclude populations became a standard of practice. He wrote a book called Urban Land Uses in 1932, which became a main textbook for Harvard city planning and many city planning across the United States. And so in the course of his career, Harlan did the zoning plans for 563 American cities. So just to kind of give you the extent of his footprint and impact, and how data from the perspective of somebody who has racist beliefs can impact many cities in the US. One such city is we know a lot about St. Louis, but also another one, an example is Miami. This is a picture of Overtown, which was considered Miami's Harlem at the time, a thriving African-American community that through data analytics became a highway. And essentially Miami's business districts working with, let's say, a mentee of Bartholomew slated this area for the development of a major highway and the removal of this important cultural district in the center of the city. So that's why many people don't know about Overtown today. This kind of data analytics in cities had a huge backlash, and we see it in the 60s in the United States, where Jane Jacobs argues against this kind of use of technocratic planning. But I would argue that Jane had her own data, so she's not against data per se, but rather she's against data that doesn't include the voice of the citizens. And so you can see her holding up her own data set here of people arguing against the need for these highways. And so I don't think it was necessarily data that was bad. It's rather the character or the person who's using it. And so Jane very much used her own analytics. And I would like us to think about that historical framing as we think about how we use data in cities to do good rather than bad. One of the things that I also mentioned in the history is the involvement of corporations in the work that we do. And IBM has been very involved in smart cities. And this is a picture of the World Fair in which IBM is presenting its data analytics and its strategies to address cities. Fast forward, this is the same IBM promoting its work in data analytics in cities in Rio de Janeiro. And so one thing is, big data and how it's used hasn't changed that much, but I think that really we need new ways of approaching it that are not top down, as these two images from IBM show, but come from a mix of partnerships and building teams together. Let's move to chapter 2. Chapter 2 asks us to build data. So, it's surprising given all the hype swirling around the massive amounts of data in today's world that some essential data is still missing. This missing data usually represents the interests and needs of those on the margins of society, but it also often represents topics that governments and companies seek to keep hidden. So chapter 2, Build It, challenges us and communities and data specialists alike to create data needed to encourage policy action. And I'm going to show you a project from the part of the book that looks at a data project we worked on in Beijing. And it started with this image I took that looked at the hazy mess that Beijing's air looks like here. And I thought, how could they possibly have an Olympics in this city? And how could I use the fact that they're having an Olympics to expose air quality issues in China in general? How are we going to collect that data and expose those issues? We decided to really think about how we could develop sensors and mobile sensors to capture that data, but also had to team up with the press to bring the story to larger audiences. And as I mentioned in all of the projects, I'm really interested in how can we communicate issues and bring them to new groups of people. So if we're going to think about data collection of air quality, what exactly is air quality? And I think a lot of people think about the components of smog. Smog is often what we regulate with our car or transportation, and we seek to improve smog or the components of smog by addressing things like ground level ozone, particulate matter, nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide, and carbon dioxide. So these are like many of the different, let's say, chemicals that we look at when we look at air quality. For this project, we picked 2 to measure in particular, and we were strategic in picking those. One was particulate matter. Particulate matter is that fine dust that's in the air. It's largely what you saw in the air in Beijing. And we picked that because it's probably the thing that would affect the athletes the most, but also because particulate matter can travel very far. It can travel, hundreds of miles. And the government of Beijing put in regulations to try to reduce the effects of particulate matter air pollution by shutting down steel and factory centers, as well as closing emissions. Then we wanted to look at something else, which was the localized effects. And we looked at carbon monoxide. And carbon monoxide could help us measure some of the policies around reducing the number of cars on the roadway. And we thought this would be a great way to test how these policies were in fact acting. So how do we get air quality data? One way is to get this MODIS satellite image. This is actually showing you particulate matter data. And the Wall Street Journal was using that as a way to show air quality, but these large regional satellites, really didn't get at the fact that air pollution can be really highly localized. What's happening on one block versus another is dependent on the context of the city. So we set out with the Associated Press to design very localized handheld air quality sensors. And here's one of our AP reporters talking about it. And just weeks before the Olympics, you can see that smoggy air quality mess still exists. And we set out reporters across the city to the Olympic Park, Tiananmen Square, and Temple of Heaven to record each one of those places, as well as the main press center and the center of the Olympic Games. The reporters were largely photographers who were deployed throughout the city, and I should note that this poor photographer became the only person measuring towards the end because many of the photographers were being captured or not captured, taken in by the police and being questioned about the photos they were taking. And the press was very concerned that the censors would also cause a problem. So we had just maybe 5 reporters towards the end of the project, and I'd love to talk about that at some point. The Associated Press made a data visualization from that was both included images of the sky as well as showing the amount of air quality here compared to what you would see in New York or Paris. Here is a data visualization. This red shows the air quality in Beijing versus the yellow is New York and London. And you can see that many days it's way over the World Health Standard. And even in fact, well above the World Health Standard for developing countries. And this became the only data used in reporting about the Olympics because the government was not releasing data. So the AP used these data sets to help communicate evidence. Because the Olympics were highly mobile, we wanted to actually look at the marathon route. Our poor reporters set out again and traveled in car to look at the marathon route and the air quality, specifically looking at CO. We did the same in New York City at that time and developed this data visualization for the New York Times that actually showed that removal of half the cars on the roadway actually did improve air quality in many areas. So you can see this is before the removal of cars on the roadway on this side of the screen. And then here we see after the cars were removed. And then here is very comparable to what you would see in New York City. And so, while the air quality improved over the course of the Olympic, as evidenced by even this data set of images, I think one thing that did happen and stayed in Beijing for some time was the even odd car mandate in order to reduce air quality. And some of the work that we did here to prove that the cars being removed from the roadway did in fact improve the quality was used as evidence for this. But I'd like to say that community data collection projects do much more than collecting data. They help to create communities of action. So something else we talk about in the book is a project where several communities wanted to investigate environmental conditions. In this case, we're looking at a community group that came together to map using air balloons the extent of the Horizon oil spill in Louisiana. But this, what happened is they came together to map this, and then each one of these group members really advocated for a change. This is also true for another project in Kenya, which set out to map and designate some of the informal settlements. So there was a contestation about who owned what. And this project used those same balloons to map the community. Another project that I think does a lot more than just, let's say, collect data is this project which looked at radiation after the earthquake and tsunami in Japan. And I think what's important about this project is that these Geiger measures were built by community members and coming together to co-build these devices created a larger community interested in doing this work and was much more successful because of the co-building and co-creation of the devices themselves. So it created excitement around collecting the data, but also the kind of, let's say, stewardship needed for this kind of long-term data collection project to continue. We see communities also develop around disaster events and using crowdsourcing to map those, as well, as you can see here. And one project that we worked on in the lab looked at how we could use these kind of qualitative and quantitative data to teach data literacy to youth. So one of the big things I think data collection projects do is teach data literacy. So you can see in the Geiger counter example and the air quality example, the communities need to learn what that data measurement is to acquire the knowledge. And like through that acquisition of knowledge, they can really be advocates. In the City Digit project, we wanted to think about how lottery was affecting the neighborhoods in and around the school in New York City. And we wanted to use the lottery as an example of how data manifests itself in cities, while also teaching them real math skills and having them create or argue for different social changes. So the students learned that the lottery has a certain kind of probability, and that probability is off, but also that lottery information is used to help in shoring up deficits in education. But they also learned that the geography of who spends money on the lottery is different across the city, and that's showing that many low-income neighborhoods spend a greater proportion of their income on lottery data. So here is the interactive maps that became part of the curriculum, and use data and data visualizations to teach the youth about ratios, but also inequities in the cities. Then the youth went out to, after having done that research, they went out and to collect their own stories, and they interviewed people on the street about whether they thought the lottery was good or bad. Ultimately created a narrative where they could take action with the data. And this data set was an open data set that's available by the lottery. Here you can see that the odds are always off. Green means you spend more than you win. But also here we're looking at how the youth could go through the mapping system to look at the odds of winning, but also the differences in between neighborhoods and how much of their income they spend on the lottery overall. This curriculum is now part of New York City's public schools, and youth use the interactive visualization to become kind of citizen journalists. And here you can see them adding data to the map. And these students actually created a group called Mathavism, which is math and activism together. So how can they use data to activate and tell people about the adverse effects of buying lottery tickets? And here they're teaching the other teachers the curriculum themselves. And I'm just gonna go quickly through that to the next project. And one of the things, sorry, that it kind of fast forwarded quickly is most of the projects that we work on, we bring to exhibition spaces and try to bring to broader publics. Here you're seeing the work in the Cooper Hewitt Museum in New York City. So chapter 3, Hack It, is using data creatively. And so while Build It describes how to collect missing data and use it to build communities, Hack It shows that oftentimes data already exists openly, although we might not see it that way because it's stored and maintained by private companies. In some countries where data is tightly controlled by the government who produces it, privately owned data is the only data that exists for analyzing dynamics of our life. The third chapter argues that we ought to be creative in the ways we obtain data to answer important questions about society. So here, the narrative starts with a project that we did in China looking at ghost cities. And if you're not familiar with ghost cities, they are really developments that lie completely vacant. And mapping vacant residential developments can identify risk in Chinese real estate market. So think about identifying the foreclosure crisis before it happens. But data about vacant developments is extremely hard to get. And data in China in general is extremely hard to get. So we began to think about, well, how can we identify where these ghost cities exist? And we started with the premise that thriving communities need amenities, and that if we could find those locations that were missing amenities, we might be able to identify ghost cities. So we scraped data from Dianping, which is the Chinese version of Yelp, to find amenities in 10 different cities. Here we're looking at Chengdu, and we also scraped data from the Chinese version of Google Maps to find all the residential locations. We applied a 300 by 300 meter grid over each area to identify a residential location. Then we measured the distance from each centroid of a residential area to an amenity. Then to see if an amenity was actually used, we looked at how many reviews they are. So were they actually something people went to or not? We created an amenity score based on Hanson's gravitational model for accessibility that thinks about the fact that we might travel further if we live in a suburban area or further from the city center. We took those amenity scores that were above the mean or way below the mean, and then we performed spatial autocorrelation on the cells that remain, saying if you are a low amenity score and you're next to each other, you're probably a ghost city. Then, as I mentioned earlier, ground truthing is really important to the work that we do. So we went to Chengdu, Tianjin, and Xi'an to test out what we found. In Xi'an, these are some of the results. Here we found developments that looked like this. The Chinese government would argue that eventually these residential developments will be occupied in 5 to 10 years, and they're being readied for people to move in. We also found many developments that were stalled around largely vacant or semi-occupied developments. So this is one example. And it's important to note that in China, when you ready land for development, whoever was living on that land often gets to occupy the housing. So in this particular case, many of the occupants of these current projects were people who formerly lived in villages in these lands. It's also important to note that some of these might be completely vacant in that nobody's living there, but they're completely bought out. And this is because Chinese families are encouraged to own 4 or 5 residents as a form of investment. We also found developments like this one, which is former communist housing, probably being readied for redevelopment itself. We also found whole cities. So this is an image just outside of Chiang. Here we see a whole city that started to be constructed. This was intended to be the science center and was never built. We took our data and put it into an interactive map that showed each city and the amenity score results. And what it allows you to do is click on the cell, and then you can see the variables behind the model. So what made each cell a ghost city? So here we're seeing like distance from basic shopping. In other places, you can see that it's distance from school. And what we're trying to do is kind of remove the black box of our data analytics and bring it and have a conversation about the results. This project, as I said, I think ground truthing also means asking the people who live in the context that we're working with what they think. And so we brought this data visualization to city planners and real estate agents. And I think what's really interesting about our dialogue is that they were much more open in discussing the work because we were using the map as a framing of the conversation. So here we see that a senior urban planner talks about the vacant developments are very controversial to local politics. They know they exist, but they're really mandated from government agencies. And here we see the deputy director of Yongdong District talking about that decisions of where to put developments aren't made on any data, but rather just where land is open. And he's talking about, should we be able to use big data and look at amenities, we might be able to use better places. A real estate developer, told us the burst of the real estate bubble will carry irreversible impacts on residents who buy homes and mortgages. And so one of the things that he communicated to us while we were looking at the map is, that these areas might be vacant, but part of it is because the government and the banks are the same thing. And so when a developer develops a property and can't sell it out completely, they need to give the loan money back to the bank. But if they can't do that, one mechanism is they open up more land for development, give the real estate developer a loan for that property. They use that loan to pay back their previous loan. So it's become kind of a Ponzi scheme of development, and part of the reason for this happening. And we talk to academics that talk about the mismatch between supply and demand geospatially being a huge problem, and that identifying this match and addressing the oversupply is really important for risk in the global marketplace, not just the Chinese marketplace. And so we believe the maps that we created really hopefully predict foreclosure crisis before it happens, or potential risks in the Chinese real estate market. Again, bringing it to big publics or more publics. We had an exhibition. This is in the Seoul Biennial, where we allowed people to interact with the maps, while drone imagery of our site visits were displayed on top, helping to bring the issue of ghost cities to many more people. So chapter 4, share it, communicating data insights. While Hackett asks us to innovatively find and acquire and analyze data for policy change, the chapter 4 stresses the importance of sharing data both in its raw form, which we often hear about open data, but also through visualizations. Sharing data helps the public have access to information, acquire knowledge, and ultimately make better civic decisions. Sharing data through visualizations can communicate the insights of data without asking everyone to be data scientists. And that's where our role as designers become really important. How can we translate those insights to and communicate them? So in this story in the book, I take you all to Nairobi, Kenya, which I've been working in for like almost 20 years now. And much of my work has involved the transportation sector. And Nairobi, like many developing cities, suffers from severe congestion problems. In my early work in Nairobi, I worked on transportation models, but could not find the data to make these models. And I made one of the first openly available GIS data sets by using machine learning on satellite image to create this first image of the roadways and a density map of building footprints. This was done in 2006, way before the hype of AI, but now is used very often in development to create that missing data that we see. But as I was working on these early transportation models, I didn't have data on matatus. And matatus are these mini buses. They are the main form of transit in Nairobi. And 3.5 million people depend upon Nairobi's matatus for mobility. While it's the essential transportation, like the only way that citizens in Nairobi knew how to get around is by asking their local matatu driver. Can you imagine like not knowing what the map of your public transit system is? And so I thought, how could we create raw data for our model, but data that everyone could use? And we also thought about the fact that everybody in Nairobi uses their cell phones for everything. And could we leverage the cell phone use in Nairobi to build a data set? So we worked with the University of Nairobi to create an app which would collect data as people were riding the matatus. And here you can see one of our students from the University of Nairobi working on this. Is there somebody talking? I don't know, maybe we can mute. It's just a little, I'm sorry, I just take a pause. I'm glad you're excited and talking. So we collected this data in GTFS format. And I just stop and mention this. GTFS is a data format you guys have all used when you navigate yourself in Google Maps for a public transit system. It uses this format in the background. And the reason I stop and mention this is because when you build data in a standardized format, you make it instantly accessible to more people and usable. So there's tons of open source software that use GTFS as its framing. And so by creating data in this standardized format, we were able to get a lot of different uses of it, which I'll talk about in a second. But GTFS, if you're not familiar with it, is just a text file which provides latitude and longitude information, the name of the bus stop and its connection and schedule. And as we brought the data in, you can see here that it begins to map the roadways. But as I mentioned, like, how do we visualize this data for everybody who's not using my model? And while I can use GTFS data for my model, how can I see it? And so we started to begin to think about what could be a map that we look at. So we created a map much like you would see in New York, London, or Paris, that represented the system. And then we worked with the Matatu drivers and owners to edit that map. And here you can see them instantly planning, noticing that there's a lack of Matatus in the north and instantly planning new routes. And really, I think this shows the power of visualization, that they could finally see the system as one comprehensive system to be planned for. We held workshops with also government officials, and the maps ultimately went viral on their internet and were provided as inserts into the newspaper. And one of the things I like to mention here is, how do you measure success of an open data project or data visualization project such as this? And it's when others leverage the data for their own change. And here, what we can see is we were really excited when the government invited us to a press conference where they made it the official map of the city. And I think what's exciting about that is, one, we kept them involved in the process all along. They were largely disinterested, but then once they saw the map, they were super excited, instantly knew how to use it, but also trusted our process so much so that they could use it as the official map of the city. Google also leveraged on our data, and it's the first informal transit system in Google Maps. Now we've worked with many cities to get their informal system in Google Maps, and you can see it allows people to make better decisions. So a lot of times when you were going from Junction to Kigame flyover, you would go into city and come back, but now it's showing you alternative routes that get you through the city much more quickly. Again, the power of visualization. This is not our map. You only saw it for a second, so you might not be aware of this, but this is actually a copy of the style of our map that was used by the World Bank for their BRT system, so bus rapid transit, in which they create dedicated lanes. And they used kind of the popularity of our map design as a way to get their design for the BRT system approved. I mean, it looks almost exactly the same. It's hard to tell, except for these routes. And then we worked very closely with the tech sector in explaining what GTFS was. And there's now 5 apps that use GTFS data as a background. So semi-formal transit provides mobility around the world, not just in Nairobi, but places as far off as Amman to Managua. And our work inspired many cities. And so we now have a global network of mapping informal transit data. And this global network sets out to capture, measure, visualize, and connect policy experts to use this data to improve transportation. Our center in Africa started in 2018, and then we have a Latin America version that was developed in 2019. And we just recently finished mapping Santiago and Dominican Republic under this new center. And here you can see they have something called Calativos. This is their version of Matatus. And these are volunteers using a new map that app that we created that's based off of some existing work in the Latin America region. We worked with the drivers, students from the universities to map the routes and ultimately change it into a map here. And you can see this is the head of the Calativo Union, being very proud to have this new resource. The last chapter of the book really talks about data as a public good. And a public good is a non-rivalrous commodity that can be valued by all who consume it. A commodity similar to electricity, which needs regulation so that it can be used equitably by the public. Society should work with private companies to find ways for them to share their data ethically and responsibly so that it can use for a public good. And a lot of what's behind this chapter that while we're in the era of big data, many places are still missing data. Here in the US, we're missing a lot of data on race and ethnicity, but also in Africa, essential data is missing, and it's critical for creating and formulating policy. And the World Bank said that not having data sets can lead to a denial of basic rights, which is why it's become an important sustainable development goal. And one of the biggest goals in the most recent sustainable development goals is creating data in all sectors to improve the quality of life. But while all of this data is missing, something really unnerved me in that this data exists. And it exists in the hands of Facebook and Google and others. And I really set out a call to action. So how can we use this data, this privately owned data, for a public good? And how can we make sure these large companies don't become data colonizer and use their power of data to control these regions? And so I discuss a lot about where I think we need to move forward as we think about the relationship between power and control of data set, but ultimately argue that data should be a public good in the same way that electricity is. I'm going to end the talk today with just talking about the principles that I pull out in the conclusion that I think we can all live by if we want to use data ethically and responsibly. So first, I say, when we're using data, attempt to do no harm. We must interrogate the reasons we want to use data and determine the potential for our work to do more harm than good. 2, build teams. Building teams to create narratives around data for action is essential for communicating the results effectively. Change power dynamics, everybody. Building data changes power and inherent in controlling and using data, while also having numerous side benefits, such as teaching data literacy, as we saw in the City Digits project. 4, expose hidden systems. Come up with unique ways to acquire, quantify, and model data that can expose underlying systems to the public, but do that ethically and responsibly, going back to the first principle, making sure you're not exposing things that could cause anyone harm. Ground truth. We must validate the work we do with data by literally observing the phenomenon on the ground and asking those inside the data it affects and interpret those results. Share data. Sharing data is essential for communicating the need for policy change and generating debate essential for that work. Data visualizations are effective at doing that. And then finally, create your own ethical standards. And I think in all of the debates that we hear about data right now, we don't have a lot of regulations about how it can be used. We ask people like Facebook to regulate themselves, but there's no reason for them to do that. It's against their business. At the same time, governments aren't regulating because it's against their interests. They benefit from buying and using this data for surveillance purposes. So it's up to us in that lack of regulation to set our own ethical practices. So, hopefully I gave you kind of an overview of how you can use data for action. And I look forward to your questions. Right now, we're working on a project in Nairobi, Kenya, which we hope does that by creating a wireless internet access point. And would love to talk to you guys more about that. But I think I gave you a breadth of projects, and I would really love to have a conversation with you now. So I'd love to open it up for questions.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thanks for sharing actually a series of chapters that are extracted from the book, but they also could be a book by themselves, like each chapter. A few weeks ago, we had a conference very much on focused on this idea of hacking data and using the communities in a more bottom-up process, let's say, to understand how we can make transparent certain data about the urban. And in your talk today, what I think it's really exciting and very interesting, in my opinion, is the fact that you are actually trying to understand or to make, let's say, obvious that data analytics could have huge urban impact. Whereas this is the example of massive highways that you have shown in the beginning of your talk in Miami. But also that massive urban impact could be not only negative but positive, no? As your last exceptional projects in relation to create basic services for users in remote areas, in areas where there is no resources, such as the very basic, like guidance metro map, bus map, sorry, for Nairobi. And I mean, it's not a question, it's just like an observation that it becomes very obvious that we do live in a world of data not only for cities, but also for different kind of scales. Like a few years ago, we were working on a project on how by making transparent the data of how much energy the buildings are consuming, then like not only the design of buildings can change, but also the behavior of people inhabiting those buildings. And I think that it's very interesting to understand that data can become the tool for positive change to happen, but also it can be like a destructive weapon if it is used in a way that is not serving the society, is not serving issues such as climate change or social inequality. So the designer, or let's say the analyst, and I call it designer because we're all designers, we're designing material systems, buildings, cities in different scales, in our different programs, but then data is always there. Especially when we're working with computational design, data is there. So the designer becomes a kind of a very important figure, having huge responsibility on how to use this data or how to extract the information needed for making an architectural proposal, for making an urban proposal, no? And again, it was just like things that I was thinking. It's not a direct question. I don't know if you want to add into that.
Yeah, no, I love your reflections, and like, I'm glad you noticed this kind of example at the beginning of, transportation can be empowering, or also it can be exclusionary, and kind of tried to tie those two things together. Yeah, and I was so excited to hear that you guys are working on these areas, and particularly like hacking data sets. I think, private data, I mean, now it's something like 80% of the world's data is privately owned. And, for the first time, private institutions have more data than government. So we really need to think about ways to work towards making our own data sets from the community perspective, or working with them. So I'm glad you guys are thinking about that too. I also love that you reflected on the scales, because data has many scales.
It does. Okay, we have a lot of questions in the chat, and I'm pretty sure that there are more questions to come. So we have 15 minutes until the end, and I think that Clara, do you want to just unmute yourself and make your question? Clara is asking. Clara? I'm still in the office. Okay, Clara, that's fine. She's asking whereas you had any feedback after some time has passed from the project in Nairobi, and on the positive impact on the congestion problem that this could have in the city. Could the problem be addressed apart from giving this mapping network to the citizens?
Yeah, so I think like the main way that the Nairobi data was used was, in fact, as trying to map out where those BRT lines. So we opened it up for our model to think about, new street development and street widths, but it was also used as evidence for putting those, where to put the BRT system, where the most use would be made of that bus rapid transit system, which is meant to then improve the traffic by allocating that single lane. So knowing where the most matatus were being used helped them to identify that location. And in fact, they created a BRT line along Tika Road, which was the orange line. You might forget first. I think that probably what was more important about that project, though, was the fact that many NGOs and different organizations that came to work in transportation in Nairobi just thought the matatus were kind of independently owned and not didn't have an organizational structure. They have like a owners union, and they plan together, even though they're a little bit mafioso in their the way that outcome happens. And so by showing that the system was organized, a lot more efforts were put into improving the safety of the matatus and knowing who to contact and understanding, let's say, how to improve the transportation and mobility every day for the citizens, because they could actually see it as one comprehensive system. I definitely think Nairobi citizens now have a better idea to how to get around, since they can use Google Maps, and hopefully they make better decisions there too.
Okay. I'm going to combine two questions. Inigo is actually asking, whereas as architects, we can have an important role in the field of data visualization and communication. And then Rasa also wants to know a bit more about the software and the technical tools that you're using in the different visualization and analytical processes.
So as I mentioned, I think that architects absolutely should be included in this process. And there's a number of reasons that I think it's important. One is, I think as a training, architects are very good at telling narratives and communicating those narratives as evidence for their buildings. But also here we're talking about how do architects create a narrative around the need for change in communities. And so I think that's one reason. I also think, like, in that training, architects understand how to bring insights to larger groups of people as well. So while graphic designers do that too, I think at least my training as an architect really helps me to communicate. And then finally, what does it mean architecturally, some of these issues? How do we as designers address the very real on the ground problems? And so if we bring again the Nairobi project to bear, one of the things that we did is actually collect data on where crashes happened and where they happen most often. Then we related those to urban design patterns in those communities. And then we were able to use that data to get those sidewalks put in place or other kinds of city design elements. So architects has many roles or hats in I think data visualization. In terms of the software, I use all kinds of software for all the projects, from GIS and QGIS to D3. And I teach a big data visualization class where we do a lot of work with Python and then move into D3. So using Python to do, let's say, the data analysis, and then use D3 to do the visualization. We use things like Mapbox to make the maps. That Ghost Cities project is largely built off of Mapbox. So we're lucky to have many open source software tools at our fingertips.
Cool. Masa, do you want to unmute to do your question?
Yes, thank you, Sarah, for the inspiring work. I know that a lot of cities are trying to embed the circular economy approach in them. And in order to address that, the material flows are very crucial. And I want to know, how would you think about applying the methodology that you have introduced in order to address the material flows in the city? And I'm eager to know the thought process that how you customize the methodology in order for each case, and in this case, the material flows, and what would be the starting point, and also the scale that you would approach it in the beginning. Would you go for a sampling process that is a more bottom-up approach, or push for opening up data sets that usually big companies acquire so that we can have access to the data that could be helpful for planning the transition to circular cities? Thank you.
I mean,
Sarah, before you answering, may I ask you to stop sharing the screen so that we are all...
oh yeah, so we can see, yeah.
Yeah, that's, thanks.
Good to see you. Yeah, so I think that your question is an interesting one, because I think the first thing you have to address is like, who do you want to be addressing in this mapping project? So do you want to be addressing the city or city official? Do you want just the average person to know about this problem or project? Do you want to change the system, right? And so I always tell my students, when you're thinking about a data project, decide first the audience that you're seeking. And that can tell you a lot about where to get the data. So like an example from your example is like, what if you just want to expose the fact that we throw away most of our trash and that it doesn't become a circular system, because your audience doesn't know how much trash gets thrown away. So maybe you collect data about where trash goes, right? Another example would be, I have a friend who runs a company called SourceMap, and he basically figures out basically the flow of different food resources as they come to you. So he traces them all the way back to the cocoa farm, to like your doorstep. I think like that's really interesting, in that many companies don't even know where they get, let's say, their cocoa data. Mars knows they get a whole bunch of chocolate delivered to, into a truck, but they don't know where the farms come from and who are on the farms, because it's so consolidated. So that's another kind of material flow that he maps out by tracing kind of the distribution back. But maybe I'll stop there, because there's just I think starting with the audience is important, and then thinking about how to access the data is a next step along the line.
Thank you.
Gianluca, do you want to unmute and say your question?
Okay, yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much, Sarah, for your very interesting presentation. And my question revolves around a field which I'm researching right now, which is frameworks of data governance for a project with a social impact. And the problem my researching is focusing on is the fact that there's a big focus on data governance frameworks, mostly for commercial and private projects, while for mostly a social project or a project with dealing with data sharing, there is a lack, as you said before, of data literacy, but also of human resources that are capable in dealing with data and data science, and of frameworks for data governance and data management. I know it's a very broad question, but did you encounter any problem in this field in use? And if so, what are some of your reflection, or how did you overcome it? Thank you.
Right. So like, did I encounter any problems with like data governance, or who should be setting privacy actions, or whether my data is private? I think one of the biggest things that we need to solve is data governance. And I find it to be a problem in all in different ways on different aspects of the projects that I work on, right? So like if you take the example of Nairobi, nobody's in charge of collecting that data. Who should be in charge? Should that be a service that the government provides, which they're not doing? But then at the same time, how do you protect the privacy? So in like what's interesting is, right, like data governance is highly political. So in the case of Nairobi, the government didn't want to collect the data because they don't want to seem like they control the matatus, which are informal. So they don't want to be responsible for them. Therefore, they don't collect the data on it. But I'm not sure if that's what you're talking about, that kind of data governance. That's one. I think there's also a kind of data governance that talks about what regulations we have. So things like GDPR and how we regulate the ways in which our data can be used. And I think while GDPR is a great step in protecting our data, I think that there's a lot left open, right? Because in a way, we're still opting in and agreeing to give our data set to companies, and GDPR allows for that use and allows companies to do whatever they want with it as long as we agree to the terms still. So in that way, we're still open to being like our data to being exploited internal to those companies. I'm not saying external, like there'll be a data breach, but the ways that they can use it internally to, let's say, sell us products or sell us other kinds of information. One great example recently is, like all of the cell phone, all of our cell phones or apps collect like our GPS. And unless we say that we don't want that data collected, that data goes to third-party resellers that have that data. Those third-party resellers then sell that data to governments and others. They're not maybe tracking individuals, but they're still collecting and using privately owned data for their own intent. We still don't, how can you use that data? And I guess related to that is a great example is the Cambridge Analytica scandal, where we still don't have real regulations about how that data can target us with fake news or fake information as well. But I'm going to stop there and let another question. Hopefully I
Thank you very
answered
much.
some of it.
Yeah, I know it's a very broad field. I'm writing a whole thesis on it, so I know.
Yeah, like it could go everywhere, but the last chapter of the book, I talk a lot about this. So if you want to check that out, certainly I would recommend it.
Oh yeah, definitely will. Thank you.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you, Sarah. I think Alex.
Yeah.
Alex, yeah.
Yes, thank you, Edith. Thank you so much, Sarah, for your very inspiring and very relevant to our times talk. I have a question that I think might be a bit difficult, but I want to go for it because I think there's been few times in history that accurate data collection and data literacy has had such a direct impact, not only on national policy, but also on people's lives. I think I can even go as far as saying that efficient and precise coordination of data collection and visualization across the world has literally proved to be a matter of life and death, as well as a matter of economies either crumbling down or staying strong. On top of that, it seems to me that when it comes to global issues such as COVID-19 and climate change, if there's not an efficient, credible, and transparent coordination and communication of data, even the most sophisticated data collection technologies seem to be of little importance as they transform it into tools that deploy political agendas. So I was wondering if you could share your thoughts, insights, and personal perspective on the efforts made by governments, the international community of scientists, as well as local communities on working together in a coordinated manner to have consistent data collection for topics as vital as these. And how do you imagine we will measure the success of our efforts in the years to come?
It's a big question, Alex. I love it. Go big. I think maybe it's a complicated question. Maybe I'll use an example, like, and maybe this is where you're coming from is, right, what COVID-19 exposed in terms of what we actually do collect in terms of data, right? So we hear constantly that we're a big data society, yet when it came to COVID-19, we had a very insufficient system of collecting and coordinating data within, and this is throughout many European and American, and I know examples from the UK and the US. In the US, I mean, every state had a different way of reporting, and it was like, highly irregular and didn't include racial information. And I think that lack of coordination is very political, and it's in a way an intended or a purposeful outcome, right? Because in a way, not having data means you can't address some important issues that you need to, right? And so I think a lot of times we talk about like, well, why didn't they do it? They should have had this system. Well, it's just super political. They don't want to be responsible for certain aspects of things, and not collecting the data makes them not responsible for them. I think that's something that we often forget. I do think that I hope that this kind of fissure and fracture now is very real to all of us, right? Like we see it. It affects our everyday life. We look at the map on the screen every day and wonder how complete it is, and that we as the public can advocate for those systems to come together. But I do think it will take an advocacy, because of the politics around not having that data are strong as well, right? So it's this, it's a balance that we will continue to have. And so just like in Nairobi, our governments didn't want to collect data on the matatus, our government, benefits from not having a full picture sometimes. And perhaps that's a cynical view.
But these controversies are part of all the process working with data, no? Because, as you said, it is political at the end of the day.
It's very critical, and it's critical that we demand that data collection happen. So, like in the US, we have the COVID Tracking Project, which is a citizen-led nonprofit group that started to collect and organize and systematize the data, which is exciting. And I'm super excited that we have groups like that, but it also makes me feel like, why is the market taking care of something the government should be? And so this is like our neoliberal society at work, maybe.
Thank you, Sarah. I think that would have been a great way to close, but I can help on giving the floor to the last question. Valentina has a strong interest. I don't know if you're here, Valentina, and you want to unmute.
Yeah, hi, can you hear? Hi, hello. Oh, thank you, Sarah. Thank you to all of you to invite us to join to this important investigation research contribution. I wonder if your methodology of investigation in different Chinese ghost city has been tested also in some others African contexts, such as in Angola, where I know that there are several ghost cities where the typical zoning imposition of the social and also physical space are commonly used. And also, can you also suggest us some kind of references on these issues regarding how we can catch some data for regarding the data mining issues in the physical, but also social and the economic dimension, because of the lack of data in some context like Africa. Thank you.
So are you asking, oh, and you also have it in the chat here. So one thing that we have done with a project like the Ghost Cities in Africa was we have scraped data from like Google Maps and like African versions of Yelp to create land use maps that don't exist. So try to identify residential neighborhoods versus like commercial and industrial district, because in many cities, like basic land use, like a basic land use map doesn't exist. So we've done that kind of scraping to create that data set. The other thing that we've done is we partnered with Facebook to use their data to estimate maps of wealth based on connectivity and other kinds of issues. We've created from their data sets like internet connectivity maps and so forth. The one thing about that, though, that's very different from the data scraping that I talk about is that, like, I had to make a partnership with Facebook, sign my life away, say, you know, kind of make sure that we wouldn't do any harm, which is great, but it's not as easy as, let's say, scraping the data that we did to make these land use maps.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. We actually need to wrap up the session. Thank you everybody for joining us and for participating, and a huge thanks to Sarah for sharing her work and her passion about the work. I think we're all leaving the virtual room with a raised awareness and an increased responsibility feeling on how we should be using data in our work, and then how we can use data for public good. So thank you for sharing this. Everybody, if interested, you can also buy the book of Sarah, and you can also visit the exhibition. The link of the exhibition is in the beginning of the chat. So please feel free to navigate. Thank you very much, Sarah, and yeah, I hope we can soon have you here in Barcelona.
Thank you for all your great questions, everyone. I mean, really, thank you. Wonderful questions, and I wish I was like having a drink with you after the talk so we could chat more. But hopefully sometime I can make it to Barcelona. Thanks again, guys.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Have a lovely evening. Bye-bye.